We have to make sure that the politicians are held accountable.
Every administration had the ability to put a ban on asbestos.
When it comes to asbestos, it really is about power, money, and politics.
We have a few moments for, about 10 minutes actually, for questions. So you should come to the mic up here. While you do so, you know, interesting, Celeste, the word legacy, because I usually associate legacy with positive legacy, right? Positive things that have occurred in the past, someone's legacy that they leave to future generations or whatever. This is a different kind of legacy, and I think we do need a different word, actually. Nothing comes to mind, but we need to think of some other way of discussing that. Yes, question.
Celeste, you talk about the chlor-alkali industry making chlorine. As a consumer, how is that chlorine used? Is it in our swimming pools? Is it in our laundry? How do they use it? Any ideas?
I don't know specifically, but I assume that chlorine is chlorine. It's going to be used in all different kind of products. I think the other thing we need to think about with that chlorine process is it involved a lot of water. A lot of water. So even if they make assertions about that it's safely used and contained, we have to think about the wastewater and how much of that wastewater contains the asbestos fibers. Does anyone else?
Yeah.
There's an important part of your question, Marilyn. It's also used to make caustic soda, and Dr. Castleman is the expert. I think that can address a lot of this. But after they use asbestos to make the diaphragms, there is a process, so-called process, and there is an element of just a pathway of exposure from the mine to the ports, to the industry, obviously during replacement and disposal. So we're thinking sort of end product, and then we have to get everyone thinking big chemical pathways. But your question is really good. And Dr. Castleman, did you want to add something to that?
One of the things that concerns me as to products is that the chlor-alkali industry produces chlorine and alkali, or sodium hydroxide, or caustic soda as it's called. This is the other product in addition to chlorine gas that comes out of this industrial process in huge amounts. And about 3% of that is used in food processing or in pH monitoring and altering of water supplies. So this is a concern because the deterioration of the diaphragm shows up in asbestos contamination of the sodium hydroxide solution, the caustic soda, the alkali part of the chlor-alkali plant. And so this is a matter of considerable concern that this is being used in foods or in water treatment and could be ingested by people, and it's unnecessary. One of the things we've asked the EPA is that they should stop the use of chlorine from plants using asbestos diaphragms from being used in water treatment or in foods.
Thank you, Dr. Castleman.
Right, and we should point out there is a readily available alternative technology for making chlorine. There are plants in Europe that make chlorine not using asbestos at all through alternative technology. Barry?
Yeah, all the chlorine plants in Japan, for example, are membrane cell plants. They're not mercury cells, they're not asbestos diaphragm cells. In addition to, all over Europe, they've substituted non-asbestos diaphragms are also available in this country and in Europe. And so, but for some kind of short-term financial reasons, the chlorine industry in this country and in Canada, where they have one plant they want to keep using asbestos in, are asking for exemptions to these bans. But there are alternative ways of making chlorine.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? Actually, I have yeah, go ahead, Arthur.
I just want to add something to what Steve said. Not only did they find excess levels at the 59th Street entrance to the park when Solikoff was interested in the spraying of asbestos in the towers, or that first tower, they also did some air monitoring over Boston, 300 miles away. And the materials that were being sprayed, as any commercial material, will have its own individual fingerprint, what the additive materials are and such. And they were able to detect material being sprayed in New York 300 miles away in Boston. And so, you know, Barry's point about in our drinking water, we're talking about in the air, the population at large here in the United States, as long as we allow this material out there and as long as we don't confine it as we should when it's disturbed or becomes disturbed or starts breaking down, is going to continue to put people at risk. And as someone who does get involved in trying to assist people who've been exposed to asbestos, you know, long past the time I'm gone, there'll be a 50 or 60-year tail of disease because of what's currently in place. And so it's important not only to stop putting anything new in place, but to see that the stuff that's already out there gets handled properly.
Yeah, and actually, Arthur, I think we need a new word. Tail is too small, and it suggests it's a much bigger bolus or of disease that passes through generations. Yeah, Earl.
You are an extra set of eyes many times. As we try to document and visualize these issues, we have an opportunity to make the story more vivid and compelling. And so if you have an idea for photographs that will perhaps be in the Badges exhibit next year and used in Senate briefings and used by journalists to tell this story, let me know about it. Thank you.
I just want to... I have a... Yeah, Steve? Steve Moser.
I represent one of the older folks who have been involved in workplace health and safety for a long time. I think I wanted to direct a question to Courtney especially. How do we reach, what are the effective ways of reaching young people about asbestos and other hazards in the workplace?
Thank you for your question. I think for me, what's been really helpful is making connections and parallels. I think one of the most effective ways has been through sharing my story. Like, I think I talked to almost everyone about it. I got a little emotional up there, but I can speak pretty freely about it. And I think through that, folks will ask questions. And again, realizing like, this is a systemic issue. Who gets sick most often? Why do they get sick? And trying to draw, like I talk to my students a lot about it, and they would say, oh, that's similar to in our community in Detroit, X, Y, and Z. Why do we have the highest rates of pollution in our city? And so I think for a lot of people, the way to make it personal is by drawing parallels between different issues and making them realize that this is, it's not just asbestos, but it's much larger than that.
Yeah, Dick?
I just wanted to mention one other thing. As we hear a lot about having to go after the infrastructure collapse, so to speak, in the United States, bridges coming down, water systems going down. Much of the water systems throughout the south part of the United States are made from asbestos cement pipe. And as they go in to take these pipes out, these workers are being exposed. Many of them don't even know they're exposed. I think a year or so ago, we talked about this in Houston, was it? Where Linda and Celeste went down to try and educate the workers. But this is going to happen every day throughout the United States as these systems deteriorate and come apart. And so this is a message that I don't think is going to be addressed when the Congress looks at dealing with replacing our infrastructures in the United States. So I think this is a very serious potential problem that we need to address.
Linda, let me just, go ahead, Linda. Sure.
Steve, I want you to please just come back to the mic for a second. COSH folks are really important to workers. Could you just tell folks who might not know about National COSH and other COSHs what you do, why you do it, and how people could possibly help you? There's also a flyer that you brought. Just spend a couple minutes and tell people about COSH. It's important.
I've been involved in the COSH movement for a long time all across the country. COSH groups are coalitions of public health people, labor people, and workers unions who are very concerned about the whole range of what people are exposed to at work and the ill health effects that can result. So they've been very active on asbestos, on ergonomic issues, all kinds of issues. Celeste and others have been very active and supportive. One of the things that they're very involved in is Worker Memorial Day, which is coming up very soon, April 28th. There will probably be ceremonies in a lot of the cities where you live. One of the most powerful things are the stories, like Courtney said, of people who have direct exposure, either family members who've passed away. They tend to focus on the immediate. So there are people who died in trenches that should have been supported, people who fell off buildings because they didn't have proper support in terms of protections, chemical exposure. But the diseases, asbestos, people exposed to solvents, people exposed to silica, beryllium, all these different things, they're the 50,000 or so Americans who die each year as a result of work-related disease. They're not always included as much in these ceremonies, and they should be. So I would encourage you to find out about Worker Memorial Day in your locations, and especially families who've been directly affected by these problems, to get involved. There's some very powerful organizations of families who have suffered these work-related losses, and it's very important in terms of building momentum for the need for public protections. Let me end by emphasizing that word. We talk, or the other side talks a lot about regulations, and regulations have a pretty bad connotation. I speak in terms of public protections. And the COSH groups are committed very broadly to workplace health and safety. Anything that a worker encounters at work that impacts on his or her physical health or psychological health is an occupational health problem. And that's what we're committed to: prevention being the key.
Thank you, Steve. Also, for people who want to, for anyone who wants to join ADAO for Workers' Memorial Day, obviously asbestos is really the #1 carcinogen in the workplace. We do have blogs, we will have action, so please follow us, and obviously caution other folks for April 28th.
Well, that wraps up the panel. Thank you to the panel members, and if the next panel could come forward.